The Jupiter Saturn cycle is a clock in our astrological system. When Jupiter and Saturn return to the same signs, they do about every 59 years. It's very much a vector or a kind of fractaline invitation into seasons of life, and with mundane astrology, it can be very, very accurate to predict what is unfolding. And in this video, I'm going to talk about these protests, these student protests that have emerged in the last couple of weeks all over the world, all over America. They've burst into the consciousness of the news cycle. And there's a reason for it. It's because the Jupiter-Saturn cycle has triggered it effectively. So stay tuned. March 24th, 1965, the anti-war protests of the 1960s kick off in earnest at the University of Michigan with teach-ins organized by professors to protest the war, the burgeoning Vietnam War. So it spread fast, these teach-ins, the model of doing teach-ins where you sit in a space and teach and basically resist the horrific events where innocent people get killed by militaries. People don't like that, okay? And so March 24th, 1965, Jupiter was at 24 degrees of Taurus and Saturn was in the middle decan of Pisces. That should trigger in you knowledge of where those two planets are right now. Just this last week, Jupiter has been at 23 degrees of Taurus. So we have almost an exact match in this present moment's astrology of the kickoff of the anti-war protests in the 1960s. And it's almost kind of like, wow, it's too accurate to pass up or to ignore that these great planets, as they're called, are echoing exactly based on their sign in pretty close degree placements, and we get this national kind of crisis, right? You've seen the news, Columbia University. As I record this, the latest news is that they've barricaded in some of the administrative buildings. You know, this is gonna only grow is the main theme of this video, especially when you layer in the Jupiter-Saturn cycle. It's telling us we may have about 5 more years of these protests as they keep growing, and especially as these wars keep unfolding. So, you know, it's not only Columbia University, it's Harvard and Yale and my alma mater, University of Texas. You know, these videos of cops arresting students and violence against students, you know, they very much are reminiscent of the 1960s. And this is stuff we've been talking about, astrologers, for a while. We've been saying, hey, these 1960s are coming back. They're resonating because of the Jupiter-Saturn clock. And to see it emerge, it's kind of shocking even as an astrologer because it's too exact of an emergence. Protest movements on college campuses in America against war in the name of justice and peace, right? People say, don't kill innocent people. Let's stop killing innocent people, and these protests emerge under that banner. You know, another interesting resonance, the week before that University of Michigan teach-in in March 1965 was the first self-immolation of that anti-war protest. A woman named Alice Hers, 82-year-old pacifist, burned herself to death. But we just had, before these college protests triggered in earnest, Aaron Bushnell lit himself on fire protesting the complicity of the American government in the Gaza bombings by the Israeli government. So there's these resonances even at that layer of a self-immolation that sort of kicks off these protests in a way. The thing about 1965, and this was a week before Jupiter entered Gemini in 1965, Jupiter was at 28 degrees of Taurus still, and you had what's very famous, April 17th, 65, the SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, organized a march against the Vietnam War in Washington, D.C. Largest anti-war demonstration in the U.S. to date, with 20,000 people attending, is the official line. As I record this, Jupiter just left 23 degrees of Taurus and has now entered the 25th degree, or is now in 24 degrees Taurus. So even in May, we're going to get the Jupiter return exact degree of this SDS march on Washington, the largest anti-war march of its time. We may be seeing this stuff expand as we get into May, and it wouldn't surprise me at all given this cycle is almost literally repeating itself. Jupiter was in Gemini, 22 April 65 to 5 May 66. That's the wider window. It did slip into Cancer and then came back to Gemini, but that's the window of Jupiter in Gemini in the mid-1960s. Look at these events that happened while Jupiter was in Gemini. The whole time Saturn was in Pisces. So we're about to enter the exact resonance by sign of the Jupiter-Saturn mutable square Saturn from Pisces, Jupiter, and Gemini. Later in May 65, the Vietnam Day Committee organized a large teach-in at Berkeley, so these teach-ins begin to spread. October 65, International Day of Protests demonstrations of about 100,000 in 80 cities across the US. So again, spreading like it is now, protests at many universities all over the country currently protesting American complicities in the Gaza operation. But that culminated even in London, Paris, Rome. This is late October 1965, the International Day of Protest. I just saw a thread someone sent to me from Twitter that had someone saying these have gone international. There's protests about the Gaza, what many consider to be a genocide or an ethnic cleansing operation. There's protests all over the world right now. Students in the Sorbonne, I see them in Berlin. And it's shocking the way that these videos depict just hard punishment by police. I mean, police are coming down violently against protesters that are in kumbaya circles, singing peace and love. So it's very reminiscent. Then we get to 1966, Jupiter still in Gemini. You have the second days of international protest organized. Again, protests all over America and the world. So this would be coming if we apply this to our current timeline. We're talking this fall into next spring. Jupiter in Gemini, square Saturn and Pisces. And this is a feature of a mutable square, particularly with Jupiter and Saturn. This is what mutability is. It's changing, it's chaos. Jupiter in Gemini, it's, fighting for truth with words and with tactics. That's Mercury. It's tactical action. Gemini, for truth, peace, and justice, which is Jupiter. And so these combinations fit the symbolism as well. Ideas and words, Mercury, Jupiter, Gemini, and then the square with Saturn and Pisces, the foundations of the society shifting as people say, hey, the system is killing innocent people. What do we do when there's deaths of innocent people that the system has produced? Well, you get into your Gemini, your tricksterism, which is what these protest tactics often can be for purposes of seeking truth and justice. So it's kind of cool to see the astrology basically giving a green light for protest movements for peace and justice. So back in the mid-60s, it was Jupiter in Taurus, then Jupiter in Gemini, positioned against Saturn and Pisces, that kicks off basically a 5-year period of very intense protests. This stuff grows. Jupiter leaves Gemini, doesn't stop the protests. 68 in August is the DNC in Chicago, where the police were very much cracking down on the protesters. Guess what we have this year? The Democratic National Convention in Chicago again. Now, I know the Saturn-Jupiter cycle isn't resonant with the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago, but the nodal cycle is. And so I believe we may be seeing some kind of maybe early resonance in terms of Saturn-Jupiter, that this Chicago convention is really concerning for some kind of police crackdown on peace protesters. Basically, this all culminates to the 4 May 1970 Kent State Massacre, where the famous Neil Young song, 4 Dead in Ohio, those National Guardsmen, so they weren't police, they were National Guardsmen, killed the kids. And that created a big outcry. The chart of that Kent State Massacre has Jupiter in the last degree of Libra and Saturn at 12 degrees Taurus. So we're talking about Saturn entering Taurus and Jupiter in Libra. In our current timeline, that will repeat by sign in August 2028. So we're here in 2024, April, and we're talking about increasing protests culminating in maybe some kind of event in 2028, assuming this resonance continues with Jupiter, Saturn and these protests. The way I'm seeing this is it's another fractal. Like I said earlier, a fractaline vector of resonance. There's always numerous cycles operative, right? We have Pluto, we have Uranus, we have those outer planet cycles that everybody loves to talk about. Jupiter-Saturn cycles is another very, very important one. Not only the sign of their conjunctions every 20 years, but literally the signs they're in. And so this cycle is giving us a pretty accurate timeline, it seems. And that timeline says, hey, these protests could increase. We may need to be gearing up for more images of students being beaten by cops effectively for their political activity. Keep in mind that the protests were victorious. I mean, people are protesting for a reason. It's not that they're just angry. It's because they see dead kids, tens of thousands of them currently in Gaza. And in the Vietnam War period, they saw dead bodies, dead American soldiers. They saw news reports of, for example, My Lai Massacre, 1968. I think that's when that story broke. It may have been 69, Seymour Hersh's piece on My Lai. People don't like innocent people being killed. And so as long as that continues to happen, there's going to be protests. And this could be growing if this fractal is correct. I want to just point out the final piece here, the winding down of the Vietnam War, the signing of those peace accords took place in 1973. This fits with two cycles in our current timeline. The Uranus cycle, Uranus will enter Cancer in 2032. And so we end this Uranus and Gemini war trigger. Check out the series I did with Dan Waits, Astrology of the 2020s. We have a whole video about Uranus and Gemini and the war triggers that has been about. But that chart, 27 January 1973, the signing of these peace accords in Vietnam, Saturn in Gemini, Jupiter in Capricorn, a transit that first repeats by sign in our current timeline on 15 November 2031, and then Uranus enters Cancer for the first time in 2032. And so, you know, it's another reason, a traditional planet cyclical reason why we may be ramping up into some periods of intensity and crisis, but we have a kind of end date as well, early 2030s. What can mapping this do for us? Well, psychically, we might know there's some unseen resonance of the mysterious nature of repeating patterns in our reality. May take a little bit of the pressure off, one. Two, it gives a signal to apply the astrological symbolism in a way that empowers. And so in this case, what I think is a noble and worthy cause of protesting a murder of innocent people by militaries, by the state, we have a green light to use Jupiter and Gemini to deploy language for truth, as I talked about earlier. And that might be good to understand if you're going to participate in some of this stuff. You know, there's astrological support for it. You know, and finally, yeah, just honoring the mystery, the deep spiritual mystery of the unseen. It can help us maybe relieve some of the pressure of seeing really horrific images and having to read headlines and reports of devastating news, knowing that there's some kind of astrological unseen resonance, maybe at some level allows us to kind of trust the process. Those protests, remember, in the 60s created the end of the war, effectively. I mean, they worked at some level. Certainly they shifted the tide of public consciousness against the American involvement in the Vietnam War. And then finally, they give us kind of an end date, early 2030s. Maybe we'll be through this period of war for this cycle. So anyhow, take care out there. You know, I think this was an important enough resonance because it's almost exact with that 23 degrees Jupiter triggering student protests in 1965 and then again in 2024 that it's important enough to share this in the video. So take care out there. May your prayers and heart be pivoted towards justice and peace for all people, all beings, including those innocent lives that are caught up in madness, effectively. And I'll talk to you real soon. Peace.